The steel blade caught lamplight like a sliver of frozen moonlight as Tobias drew it across the leather strop one final time. In the mahogany-paneled grooming chamber, Armand Laveau settled deeper into the barber's chair, eyes closing in anticipation of his nightly ritual. The mirror reflected everything: the master's throat exposed and vulnerable, the slave's steady hands, the Sheffield razor that had shaved the same face for 7 years. Tonight, those hands would not stop at the jawline. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. This is the story of how one enslaved barber transformed an evening grooming session into an act of reckoning that would send tremors through New Orleans high society and leave the French Quarter's most powerful merchant bleeding out in his own chair. What happened in that room on Rue Royale changed everything, not just for Tobias, but for 89 souls who woke the next morning to find their world suddenly, violently different. The September heat pressed against the tall windows of the Laveau mansion like something alive and malevolent. Even at 7 in the evening, the air hung thick enough to chew, carrying the mingled scents of jasmine from the courtyard garden and sewage from the streets beyond the wrought iron gates. Tobias stood perfectly still in the doorway, his posture the result of decades of training himself into invisibility. The grandfather clock in the hallway marked each second with mechanical indifference, its brass pendulum catching reflections from the gas lamps that had recently been installed throughout the house at enormous expense. Armand Laveau prided himself on modernity, on being among the first merchants in the French Quarter to embrace new innovations. Gaslighting, imported furnishings, a private grooming chamber decorated in the latest European fashion with damask wallpaper the color of dried blood and Persian rugs that cost more than a human life. He sat now in the custom barber's chair he'd ordered from London, its leather the finest money could procure, its brass fittings polished to a mirror shine by hands that would never own anything half so fine. The merchant's fingers drummed against the armrest with barely contained excitement. His family had gathered for this week's celebration. All 3 sons returned from their various business ventures, both daughters arrived with their husbands from plantations upriver. Tomorrow night they would toast his latest triumph, the acquisition of a cotton factoring house in Mobile that would expand his empire across the Gulf Coast. Tonight was simply preparation, the ritual grooming that kept him looking distinguished for tomorrow's festivities. Tobias had performed this same service 6 evenings each week for 7 years. He knew every contour of Armand's face, every spot where the beard grew thick or thin, the precise angle the merchant preferred for his sideburns, the way he liked the razor heated just slightly in warm water before the first stroke. This knowledge had been beaten into him in the early days, back when a nick or missed patch meant hours in the courtyard pillory under the Louisiana sun. He moved now with practiced efficiency, laying out instruments on the marble-topped side table. The Sheffield razor with its 7-inch blade and horn handle. The badger hair brush. The porcelain shaving bowl with the Laveau family crest embossed in gold. The towels warmed by the fire that burned year-round in this room because Armand insisted on it despite the suffocating heat. Everything in its precise place, a performance rehearsed into muscle memory. Armand leaned back, closing his eyes. This was the part he savored most, the moment when the day's tensions melted away under the ministrations of skilled hands. He never noticed how those hands sometimes trembled with suppressed rage, or how Tobias's jaw clenched when forced to touch the flesh of the man who'd destroyed his life. Masters never noticed such things. They saw furniture that happened to move and speak when commanded. The merchant began talking, as he always did during these sessions. His voice carried the peculiar accent of New Orleans French aristocracy, lilting and nasal, punctuated with satisfaction over his own cleverness. He spoke of the Mobile deal, of how he'd outmaneuvered rivals, of the profits he anticipated. Cotton prices were rising with tensions between North and South. War might be coming, he mused, but war was simply another opportunity for men of vision and capital. Tobias worked soap into lather with the badger brush, the familiar circular motions allowing his mind to drift while his face remained a mask of attentive servitude. He thought about the letter that had arrived 3 days ago, delivered secretly by Isaiah during the morning marketing trip. The boy had pressed the folded paper into his palm while pretending to stumble, a practiced maneuver they'd refined over months of planning. The letter contained only 7 words in crude handwriting: Benjamin dead. Accident. They lied. "Come home." It was unsigned, but Tobias recognized the hand of Moses, the elderly overseer who'd taught his son carpentry at the Alabama plantation where the boy had been sold 4 years earlier. Benjamin had been 9 years old when the slave trader's wagon carried him away, screaming for his father. Tobias had been forced to stand silent in the courtyard, hands chained, watching his only child disappear into a future he could not protect him from. Now Benjamin was dead at 13, killed in some unnamed accident that Laveau's business partners had deemed not worth reporting to a slave father. The boy had probably been working equipment too dangerous for his age, pushed beyond his limits to maximize profit. His small body would have been dumped in an unmarked grave, no ceremony, no acknowledgement that he'd ever existed beyond a line item in a ledger noting a $200 loss. Tobias applied the lather to Armand's face with gentle, even strokes. The white foam obscured the merchant's features, transforming him into something almost anonymous. Almost human. But Tobias knew better. He'd watched this man sell children younger than Benjamin, separating them from screaming mothers with the casual efficiency of someone sorting livestock. He'd stood silent while Armand negotiated prices on human flesh, haggling over costs per pound like butchers discussing beef. The merchant's voice droned on, moving now to complaints about his youngest son René, who'd shown disturbing signs of abolitionist sympathy after spending time at university in Boston. Armand planned to cure the boy of such dangerous notions by involving him directly in the trade, letting him witness the necessity and profitability of the peculiar institution firsthand. Sometimes, he explained to Tobias as if to a confidant. Young men needed their sentimentality beaten out of them by reality. Tobias picked up the razor. The weight of it felt different tonight, heavier somehow, as if the steel understood its purpose had shifted. He tested the edge against his thumb, a gesture Armand had seen 1,000 times before. The blade was sharp enough to split a hair lengthwise. Sharp enough to open skin like silk. The grooming chamber fell quiet except for the crackle of the unnecessary fire and the distant sounds of the household preparing for tomorrow's celebration. Somewhere below, Esther would be starting the elaborate dinner preparations, her gnarled hands shaping pastry and seasoning sauces while her mind tracked every movement of the White family. In the stables, Marcus would be checking harnesses and polishing brass fittings on the carriages, his three-fingered hand managing tools with the adaptation born of necessity. Young Isaiah would be running errands, his sharp eyes noting which doors stayed unlocked, which servants could be trusted, which routes led to freedom. They were all waiting, though only Esther knew exactly what they were waiting for. Tobias had told her 3 nights ago while she ground spices in the kitchen, speaking in the barely audible whisper they'd perfected over years of stolen conversations. She'd listened without changing expression, her hands never pausing in their work, then nodded once. "Whatever you need," she'd said. "However far this goes." Armand settled deeper into the chair, surrendering completely to the ritual. His breathing slowed to the rhythm of approaching sleep. That vulnerable preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Vulnerable state between waking and dreams where the body relaxed its defenses. This was the moment Tobias always began the actual shaving, starting at the right sideburn and working downward with smooth, confident strokes. Tonight, his hand paused above the merchant's exposed throat. The jugular vein pulsed beneath pale skin, a blue river carrying life through the body of a man who'd built his fortune on the destruction of others. One quick slash and it would be over. Armand Laveau would bleed out in his expensive chair, his imported rug soaking up the crimson payment for crimes too numerous to calculate. But Tobias had learned patience in the same brutal school that taught him invisibility. 7 years of shaving this throat had taught him something valuable, that revenge delivered too quickly left questions unanswered, stories untold. He wanted Armand to understand why this was happening. He wanted the merchant to feel, in his final moments, the same helpless terror that Benjamin must have felt when whatever machinery or accident or deliberate cruelty had stolen his young life. The razor descended to Armand's cheek instead, removing lather and beard with the practiced precision of years. The merchant made a small sound of contentment, completely unaware that he'd just received a temporary reprieve from a death sentence years in the making. Tobias worked methodically, cleaning the blade between strokes on a towel that would soon serve a different purpose. His mind tracked through the plan he'd refined over countless sleepless nights on his cornhusk mattress in the servants' quarters. The grooming always lasted exactly 20 minutes. Armand would then proceed to the dining hall where his family waited, arriving precisely at 8 o'clock as he did every evening. They would eat the elaborate meal Esther had prepared, discuss tomorrow's celebration, retire to their respective rooms by 10. Tonight would follow the same pattern, with one crucial difference. The shaving soap Tobias had prepared contained more than the usual ingredients of tallow, lye, and lavender oil. Delphine had obtained the belladonna extract from an apothecary in the Treme district, a free woman of color who asked no questions when paid in coin that Tobias had stolen in tiny increments over 3 years. The deadly nightshade had been carefully measured and mixed, enough to cause symptoms but not immediate death. Armand would begin feeling ill during dinner, probably dismissing it as indigestion from Esther's rich cooking. The symptoms would worsen slowly, pupils dilating, heart racing, confusion setting in. By the time the family realized something was seriously wrong, Tobias would be gone, and the real message would be discovered. He finished the left side of Armand's face and paused to wipe the blade. In the mirror, their eyes met for a fraction of a second. The merchant saw nothing unusual, just the expected deference of a well-trained slave. Tobias saw everything, the casual cruelty in those eyes, the complete absence of recognition that the man he'd destroyed piece by piece might still possess the capacity for resistance. The razor moved to Armand's throat, scraping away lather in smooth upward strokes. The merchant's Adam's apple bobbed slightly with each swallow, that vulnerable protrusion of cartilage protected only by Tobias's carefully maintained control. How easy it would be. How satisfying to see shock replace complacency in those eyes. But patience. Patience was the weapon he'd spent 7 years sharpening. Tobias cleaned the last traces of lather from Armand's face with a warm towel, the cotton-absorbing soap and something else that the merchant would never detect. The belladonna worked slowly, designed to mimic the onset of illness rather than announce itself as poison. Delphine had been adamant about the dosage when she'd slipped him the vial 2 weeks ago in the courtyard shadows. Too much and death came quick with obvious signs. Too little and the symptoms passed without consequence. The amount mixed into tonight's shaving soap walked the razor's edge between those extremes. Armand opened his eyes and examined his reflection with the critical scrutiny of a man who believed his appearance reflected his station. Tobias had learned to read every micro-expression in that face, the slight tightening around the eyes that meant displeasure, the infinitesimal nod that indicated satisfaction. Tonight, the merchant smiled, revealing teeth that had cost a fortune to maintain while the people he owned lost theirs to malnutrition and neglect. Excellent work as always, Tobias. Armand's voice carried the particular tone white men used when praising slaves, that peculiar mixture of condescension and genuine appreciation for a tool that functioned exactly as designed. The merchant stood, brushing imaginary lint from his silk waistcoat embroidered with gold thread. His reflection in the mirror showed a distinguished gentleman of means, salt and pepper beard perfectly trimmed, hair pomaded into submission, the very picture of southern aristocratic refinement. What that mirror could not show was the ledger Tobias had discovered 3 months ago while cleaning this same room. The leather-bound book had been carelessly left open on Armand's desk, its pages revealing transactions that went beyond the already brutal business of legal slave trading. Names, ages, prices paid. And received. Children listed by height and weight like livestock. Families deliberately separated to maximize profit, because a mother desperate to stay with her babies would accept lower prices, while selling them apart brought premium returns from buyers with specific needs. Benjamin's name had appeared on page 47. Male child, age 9, light carpentry skills, sound teeth and limbs. Purchased from estate sale for $140. Resold to Garrison Plantation, Mobile District, for $230. Profit margin noted in the column with Armand's distinctive slanted handwriting. Below Benjamin's entry, a notation in fresher ink dated just last week. Damaged goods, total loss, no recovery possible. That was how his son's death had been recorded. Not as a child crushed by machinery or worked to collapse or beaten beyond survival. Just damaged goods. A line item representing lost profit in a book that documented hundreds of similar transactions stretching back years. Tobias had memorized that page, every detail burned into his mind like a brand, fueling the cold fury that now steadied his hand as he collected the grooming instruments. The merchant moved toward the door, pausing to adjust his cravat one final time. Tobias knew what came next because routine governed Armand's life with mechanical precision. The walk down the curved staircase to the grand dining hall. The family assembled around the table set with imported china and crystal goblets. The meal served in courses by silent hands. The conversation about cotton futures and social gossip and political maneuvering. All of it playing out like theater where some people wore costumes and spoke lines while others existed merely as props and scenery. "Will you require anything else this evening, Master Laveau?" Tobias kept his voice pitched in the exact register expected, respectful without being obsequious, present without being intrusive. 7 years had taught him the precise calibration required. "No, that will be all." Armand waved dismissively, already thinking ahead to dinner and tomorrow's triumph. "You may attend to your other duties." The merchant departed, his footsteps echoing down the hallway toward the stairs. Tobias remained motionless in the grooming chamber, listening to those footsteps fade, counting in his head the seconds it would take for Armand to reach the ground floor. 32 steps on the staircase. 15 paces across the entrance hall. Another 20 through the corridor to the dining room. He knew every measurement of this house the way a prisoner knows his cell. When silence returned, Tobias moved quickly but without panic. He gathered the shaving implements and returned them to their case, every item in its designated slot. The razor went last, its blade wiped clean though it had cut nothing but beard tonight. He would need it again soon, but not for grooming. The thought carried no satisfaction, no anticipation of violence for its own sake. What was coming felt more like amputation, the necessary removal of diseased flesh to save the whole body. He extinguished the lamps one by one, watching shadows reclaim the room. The fire in the hearth would burn itself out overnight, expensive fuel consumed for the comfort of a man who would not live to see another grooming session. Tobias took one final look around the chamber where he'd spent countless hours in forced intimacy with his oppressor, then stepped into the hallway and closed the door behind him. The servants' stairs descended steeply at the back of the house, narrow and unadorned compared to the grand staircase Armand had just traversed. These steps existed solely for function, allowing the enslaved to move through the house while remaining largely invisible to its white occupants. Tobias descended quickly, his feet finding each familiar tread without conscious thought. The kitchen occupied the entire back section of the ground floor, a domain of heat and constant activity that Esther ruled with quiet authority. She stood now at the massive iron stove, stirring a copper pot that released steam fragrant with herbs and roasted meat. Her face showed the accumulated weight of 52 years, most of them spent in bondage, but her eyes remained sharp and calculating when she glanced up at Tobias's entrance. 3 other women worked at various tasks around the kitchen. Delphine rolled pastry dough at the marble counter, her movements efficient and practiced. 2 younger slaves whose names Tobias barely knew prepared vegetables and tended other pots. The room hummed with coordinated effort, each person playing their assigned role in producing the elaborate meal that would soon be carried upstairs on silver platters. Esther caught his eye and made an almost imperceptible gesture toward the courtyard door. The younger women wouldn't notice, too focused on their tasks and too trained to question the actions of their superiors. Delphine saw but gave no reaction, her hands never pausing in their work with the rolling pin. Tobias moved to the door as if simply stepping out for air, a common enough occurrence in the kitchen's oppressive heat. The courtyard beyond provided the house's only outdoor space, a rectangular area enclosed by high brick walls and divided between practical areas for laundry and storage, and the ornamental garden Madame Celeste maintained as a showpiece for visitors. Jasmine and magnolia competed for dominance, their cloying perfume attempting to mask less pleasant urban odors. Marcus emerged from the stable section, ostensibly checking something about the carriage harness but actually positioning himself where he could see both the kitchen door and the main house. The stable master had lost 3 fingers to Armand's temper 6 years ago when a horse had thrown the merchant during a morning ride. The animal had simply spooked at a snake, but Armand needed someone to punish for his bruised dignity. Marcus's hand had been placed on a chopping block and the digits removed with a hatchet while the other slaves watched, a lesson in the price of any failure. That 3-fingered hand now gestured subtly toward the upper windows where the dining room overlooked the courtyard. Tobias could see movement behind the gauze curtains, shadows of the Laveau family taking their seats. Right on schedule. Armand's obsession with punctuality meant dinner commenced at exactly 8 o'clock every evening, a routine so rigid it could be weaponized. Young Isaiah appeared from the servants' entrance, moving with the apparent aimlessness of a teenage boy but actually completing a circuit of the property. He'd checked the front gates, confirmed they were locked as always after dark, noted which windows showed light and which rooms remained empty. All this information passed to Tobias through glances and small gestures developed over months of preparation. Esther joined them in the courtyard, wiping her hands on her apron. She spoke quietly, her voice barely carrying above the fountain's gentle splash. The soup course just went up. Roasted duck and potatoes to follow, then the cake. They'll be occupied for at least 90 minutes. That gave them time, though not much. Tobias felt the weight of the straight razor tucked inside his jacket, its familiar presence both comforting and terrible. What he was about to do would transform him into something irrevocable. There would be no return from this night, no possibility of resuming the mask of obedient servitude. Freedom or death were the only outcomes remaining, and he'd accepted that calculus when Benjamin's death notice arrived. The plan had been refined through whispered conversations and coded messages over the past 3 days. Esther and Delphine would ensure the meal proceeded normally, giving no indication anything was amiss. Marcus would prepare the fastest carriage and position it near the rear gate that accessed the service alley. Isaiah would watch for any unexpected movements from the household or patrollers in the street beyond. Tobias would return to the house through the servants' entrance and make his way to Armand's private study, the locked room where the merchant kept his most valuable documents and his strongbox of cash. The study sat directly above the dining hall, meaning any sounds would be muffled by conversation and the clatter of dining. More importantly, it contained the evidence that would ensure this night became more than just another slave killing his master. The ledger he'd discovered months ago had to be retrieved and delivered to the right hands. Father O'Malley at St. Augustine's Church had connections to abolitionist networks operating throughout the city. The Irish priest took confessions from slaves when their masters permitted such luxuries, and he'd developed ways of passing information north to newspapers and politicians who might actually care that children were being illegally sold across state lines in violation of federal restrictions on the African slave trade. Armand's ledger documented participation in that illegal trade. Ships arriving from Cuba with human cargo falsely documented as long-term American slaves. Children born in the United States but sold with forged papers claiming African origin to justify higher prices. Schemes involving falsified death certificates and invented identities. The book represented potential scandal that could damage not just Armand but the network of merchants and politicians who protected and profited from these operations. That was the true revenge Tobias sought. Not just Armand's death, which would change nothing in the larger machinery of bondage, but the exposure of crimes that might actually fracture that machinery. Benjamin's death would be answered with chaos that rippled through New Orleans commerce and society. Other families would suffer as his had suffered. Other fathers would feel the helpless rage of watching their children designated as damaged goods. Marcus spoke without looking directly at anyone, his eyes tracking the upper windows. You have maybe 2 hours before they finish dinner and start retiring. Madame Celeste usually goes to her sitting room first. The sons smoke cigars in the library. You'll need to be gone before they start moving around. Tobias nodded. The timing was tight but manageable. 30 minutes to reach the study and retrieve the ledger. Another 30 to make his way back down and out to the waiting carriage. That left an hour for unforeseen complications, and there would certainly be complications. There always were when enslaved people attempted to seize control of their own fates. Delphine emerged briefly from the kitchen, her hands still dusted with flour. She pressed something small and metallic into Tobias's palm without breaking stride, heading toward the laundry area as if on some ordinary errand. He knew without looking that she'd given him the copied key to Armand's study, fashioned from a wax impression she'd made months ago when sent to clean that forbidden room. The key felt heavier than its actual weight, dense with possibility and danger. Using it meant crossing a threshold from passive resistance to active rebellion. Slaves were forbidden to possess keys, to enter private spaces, to touch documents and money that represented the machinery of their own oppression. Every moment he remained in that study would compound his crimes in the eyes of the law that valued him at roughly the same price as a decent horse. A sound from the dining room drew their collective attention. Laughter, the distinctive bellow of Armand enjoying some comment or joke. His voice carried clearly through the open windows, holding forth about his business acumen and the fools he'd outmaneuvered. The family responded with appreciative chuckles, playing their roles in the theater of his self-satisfaction. Tobias wondered if the belladonna had begun its work yet. The symptoms would start subtly, a slight quickening of the heartbeat, perhaps some mild confusion or visual disturbances. Armand might blame the wine or the heat, dismissing discomfort as inconsequential. The poisoning was designed to unfold slowly, buying time for Tobias to complete his mission before the household erupted into crisis. He debated whether to kill Armand quickly or let him suffer. The razor could open the merchant's throat in the grooming chamber, ending everything in seconds. But that would trigger immediate alarm, lockdown of the house, search of the servants. The belladonna allowed for crucial delay, time measured in hours during which the household would attribute Armand's distress to natural causes while Tobias made his escape. Esther touched his arm briefly, a gesture that communicated both solidarity and warning. Time to move. They couldn't stand in the courtyard much longer without attracting notice from the other servants still working in the kitchen. Each of them returned to their designated areas, resuming the performance of normal activity while the night's real drama began to unfold. Tobias entered through the servants' door and climbed the narrow stairs once more. The house had settled into evening rhythms, most of the enslaved staff occupied with dinner service or preparing rooms for the family's eventual retirement. He moved through hallways with the confidence of someone who belonged there, who traversed these routes thousands of times on legitimate errands. The study door waited at the end of the second-floor corridor, dark wood panels carved with elaborate designs that probably cost more than Benjamin's purchase price. Tobias paused outside, listening for any sound of occupation. Nothing. The room should be empty, Armand being occupied downstairs and unlikely to leave dinner before its completion. The copied key slid into the lock with surprising ease. Delphine's forgery was excellent, the metal sliding past the mechanism's pins until the tumbler released. With a soft click that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet hallway. Tobias pushed the door open slowly, wincing at the slight creak of hinges that probably needed oil. The study interior revealed itself in moonlight filtering through tall windows. Armand's desk dominated the space, a massive mahogany piece with multiple drawers and compartments. Bookshelves lined two walls, filled with leather-bound volumes on commerce and law and philosophy. A liquor cabinet stood in one corner, crystal decanters catching and fragmenting the pale light. The ledger lived in the desk's bottom right drawer, locked separately from the room itself. Tobias had watched Armand access it enough times to know the approximate location, but he'd never seen where the merchant kept the small key required. He began searching methodically, checking obvious locations first. The desk's center drawer held writing implements, sealing wax, and correspondence. The upper drawers contained business papers and contracts. Nothing that looked like a key small enough for the ledger's lock. Time compressed and expanded strangely in the darkened study. Tobias knew he'd been searching for perhaps 5 minutes, but it felt both longer and shorter, each second precious and each potential hiding place requiring careful attention. He moved to the bookshelf, checking behind volumes and along the edges where a key might be secreted. A sound from downstairs froze him mid-reach. Footsteps in the entrance hall, distinctive voices. The dinner must be between courses, someone stepping out briefly. He held perfectly still, barely breathing, listening to the footsteps move toward the library rather than the stairs. After a long moment, he resumed searching. The key revealed itself in the most obvious location, tucked into a small decorative box on the desk that Tobias had initially dismissed as merely ornamental. Inside the lacquered container, 3 small keys rested on felt lining. One fit the liquor cabinet, another the desk's central lock. The third, smallest key had to be for the ledger drawer. It turned smoothly, releasing the drawer with barely a whisper of wood on wood. The ledger sat inside, leather cover unmarked except for embossed initials Laveau in gold leaf. Tobias lifted it carefully, feeling the weight of documented crimes. 5 years of illegal transactions, hundreds of lives bought and sold in violation of laws designed to at least pretend humanity had limits. He tucked the ledger inside his jacket, the leather still slightly warm from being stored in the closed drawer. This book would speak for Benjamin and for all the other children reduced to profit margins and damaged goods notations. Journalists in Boston and New York would seize on its contents. Abolitionists would use it as evidence of Southern depravity. Even moderate politicians might be forced to acknowledge that the slave trade's supposed civilized regulations were fiction maintained through deliberate blindness. Tobias closed and locked the drawer, returned the small key to its box, and retreated toward the door. His hand touched the handle just as voices erupted from downstairs, loud and alarmed. The tone was unmistakable, something had gone wrong far sooner than anticipated. He risked opening the door slightly, enough to hear more clearly. The commotion came from the dining room, multiple voices overlapping in confusion and concern. Armand's distinctive tone cut through the noise, slurred and angry, demanding to know what was happening to him. The belladonna had taken effect faster than Delphine's calculations predicted, or perhaps the merchant's constitution was weaker than expected. The household would explode into crisis within minutes. Servants would be summoned, a doctor sent for, questions asked about everything consumed during the meal. Esther and Delphine would face immediate suspicion as the meal's preparers. The window for escape was collapsing rapidly. Tobias made a decision born from years of reading white people's patterns. In crisis, they looked first to their own kind, their property coming under scrutiny only after initial panic subsided. He could use those precious minutes of confusion while the family focused on Armand's distress. He slipped from the study and moved quickly toward the servants' stairs, no longer bothering with stealth. Speed mattered more now. The stairs descended into gathering chaos, voices raised in the kitchen as word spread that the master was ill. Tobias burst into the courtyard where Marcus already had the carriage positioned, its single horse harnessed and ready. Esther appeared from the kitchen, her face tight with controlled fear. "They're calling for Dr. Dubois. Philippe thinks it's a stroke. Auguste is demanding everyone be questioned. You have minutes at most." Tobias climbed into the carriage, the ledger still tucked securely in his jacket. Marcus took the driver's position, hands already gathering the reins. Isaiah stood ready to open the rear gate that accessed the service alley. Delphine ran from the house carrying a small bundle she thrust up at Tobias. "Food, water, the papers identifying you as a free man. They'll come for me first since I prepared the shaving soap, but I'll tell them nothing." She met his eyes with fierce determination. "Make his death mean something. Make them all pay." The carriage lurched into motion as Isaiah swung the gate open. Marcus guided the horse into the alley with practiced skill, the iron-rimmed wheels clattering on cobblestones. Behind them, the Laveau mansion blazed with light as servants rushed to and fro, the household erupting into the kind of emergency that would soon transform into manhunt. Tobias looked back once at the 3-story structure where he'd spent 7 years in bondage, where his hands had been forced into unwilling intimacy with the flesh of his oppressor. Somewhere in that house, Armand Laveau was dying slowly, poisoned by the very luxury he'd indulged in daily. The merchant would have time to feel his body betraying him, to experience the helpless confusion of systems shutting down beyond his control. That was more mercy than he'd shown Benjamin. The carriage turned onto a wider street, Marcus keeping the horse at a steady pace that wouldn't attract attention. Too fast and patrollers might investigate. Too slow and they'd be caught when the alarm went out. They had perhaps 30 minutes before the city guard was mobilized, before descriptions circulated and checkpoints went up at major crossings. The bundle Delphine had prepared contained everything Tobias had requested over the past weeks. Forged free papers identifying him as Thomas Brennan, a freedman carpenter traveling to Mobile on business. Money stolen and saved coin by coin over 3 years. A letter of introduction from a fictional employer. The documents would hold up under cursory inspection but crumble under serious investigation. More importantly, the bundle contained contact information for Madame Josephine Rousseau, a free woman of color who operated a boarding house in the Treme district that secretly sheltered runaways. She maintained connections to the Underground Railroad network that moved people north through a chain of safe houses and sympathetic conductors. If Tobias could reach her establishment before the manhunt intensified, he might actually survive beyond tomorrow. The French Quarter streets remained relatively busy despite the hour, people moving between taverns and homes, delivery wagons making late rounds, the endless activity of a port city that never fully slept. Marcus navigated through this traffic with the skill of someone who'd driven these routes for years, taking turns that gradually moved them away from the wealthy districts toward areas where a black man driving a carriage attracted less notice. They passed Jackson Square where St. Louis Cathedral's spires pointed toward a heaven that seemed to have little interest in earthly injustice. Father O'Malley would be inside hearing confessions or preparing tomorrow's sermon. Tomorrow, Tobias would need to get the ledger to him somehow, perhaps through Madame Rousseau's network. The priest would know what to do with it, how to transform a slave trader's private records into public scandal. A patrol appeared ahead, 2 city guardsmen walking their rounds with lanterns and clubs. Marcus slowed the carriage naturally, giving them time to step aside. One guardsman glanced up at them with casual disinterest, seeing exactly what he expected to see, a slave performing evening duties under his master's orders. The patrol moved on without comment. Tobias felt the razor pressing against his ribs where it rested in an interior pocket. He hadn't needed it tonight after all. The belladonna had done its work without requiring his hands to open flesh. But he knew the blade's time would come. Between here and freedom lay 1,000 potential confrontations, and not all of them would end with words or forged papers. The carriage turned onto a narrower street where buildings pressed close and the smell of the nearby swamps mixed with urban waste. They were approaching the Treme district where free people of color maintained a precarious existence between enslavement and true liberty. Here the rules shifted slightly, black faces carrying themselves with dignity that would be beaten out of them in white neighborhoods. Marcus pulled the carriage to a stop in an alley behind a 2-story house with peeling paint and shuttered windows. This was as far as he could go without abandoning his own tenuous position. To flee now would mark him as complicit, bringing punishment on everyone at the Laveau household. His role ended here, with delivery of Tobias to this threshold of possible escape. The stablemaster's 3-fingered hand gripped Tobias's arm briefly. "Whatever happens, you made the right choice. Benjamin's death shouldn't mean nothing. None of their deaths should mean nothing." Tobias climbed down from the carriage, the ledger and bundle clutched against his chest. Behind them, the night carried sounds of the city continuing its routines, unaware that one small piece of its machinery had broken free. Ahead lay a door that might open onto freedom or just another kind of cage. Marcus turned the carriage around and headed back toward the French Quarter, toward the mansion where questions would already be forming about who'd prepared Armand's shaving soap, who'd had opportunity to introduce poison, who'd been seen acting strangely. Esther and Delphine would face those questions with the practiced deception of people who'd survived by hiding their true thoughts for decades. Tobias approached the door and knocked in the pattern Delphine had taught him, 3 quick raps followed by 2 slow ones. A code that meant someone fleeing bondage sought sanctuary. He waited, hearing movement inside, feeling the weight of everything that had led to this moment. The door opened to reveal a woman in her 40s with intelligent eyes and elaborate braided hair. Madame Josephine Rousseau studied him for perhaps 3 seconds, reading his desperation and determination with the practiced assessment of someone who'd made such evaluations many times before. "You're the barber," she said quietly. "We received word you might be coming. Get inside quickly before anyone sees you standing there." Tobias stepped across the threshold into lamplight and the smell of cooking food. The door closed behind him with a soft click that sounded like the end of one life and the uncertain beginning of another. Somewhere back in the French Quarter, Armand Laveau was dying in confusion and pain. Tomorrow, the city would wake to scandal and manhunt. But tonight, for the first time in 34 years, Tobias stood in a room where no one owned him, holding evidence that might actually make the machinery of bondage shudder. The razor remained unused in his pocket. The real cutting would begin tomorrow when the ledger's contents started spreading through networks of people who believed that some truths were worth the violence their revelation might unleash. Madame Rousseau's boarding house sheltered fugitives behind the fiction of serving free people of color. Tobias followed her through narrow hallways to a kitchen where others waited, their faces marked by the wariness of those who'd recently broken chains. She bolted doors and pulled curtains with practiced efficiency while explaining that word of Armand Laveau's poisoning was already spreading through the city. The kitchen smelled of coffee and fear in equal measure. 3 people occupied the space, a young man with scars mapping his shoulders like a second skin, an older woman whose hands moved constantly as if stillness meant danger, and a teenage girl who watched everything with calculating eyes. They'd all traveled paths similar to the one Tobias now walked, fleeing masters who'd pushed them past the breaking point. Tobias placed the ledger on the scarred wooden table between them. This needs to reach Father O'Malley at St. Augustine's. It documents illegal slave trading that implicates half the merchants in New Orleans. Names, dates, prices paid for human beings sold in violation of federal law. The young man examined the leather binding with fingers that trembled slightly. "You killed a white man for a book?" His tone suggested this represented either tremendous courage or catastrophic foolishness. "I killed him because he worked my son to death and recorded it as damaged goods." Tobias opened to page 47 where Benjamin's name appeared in Armand's distinctive slanted handwriting. 9 years old when sold. 13 when killed in some unnamed accident his owner didn't bother reporting to his father. The book ensures his death meant something beyond my personal revenge. Madame Rousseau studied the entries with narrowed eyes, her finger tracing down columns. Documenting transactions that violated every supposed restriction on the slave trade. Children falsely documented as African imports to justify higher prices. Families deliberately separated because desperate mothers accepted lower rates while individual sales brought premium profits. Ships arriving from Cuba with human cargo disguised through forged papers and bribed customs officials. "This could get me executed just for possessing it," she said quietly. "But it's valuable enough to justify that risk." These transactions implicate politicians who publicly support trade restrictions while privately profiting from breaking them. Abolitionist newspapers would pay substantial money for this documentation. Money that funds more escapes, bribes more officials, saves more lives. She closed the ledger and met Tobias's eyes. "Getting this to O'Malley means moving through a city that will be hunting you by morning. We'll need decoys to divide their attention, disguises to change your appearance, and perfect timing to exploit the brief window before the manhunt intensifies." They transformed him over the next 2 hours as night deepened outside. The fine servant's clothing Armand had required became rough laborer's garments stained with wood dust and paint. Madame Rousseau cut his hair shorter with steady hands, changing the silhouette guards would be watching for. Shoe polish carefully applied aged his appearance by a decade, adding shadows beneath his eyes and along his temples. The straight razor remained hidden in an interior pocket, its weight a constant reminder against his ribs. The forged papers identifying him as Thomas Brennan, free carpenter, received scrutiny from each person present. The older woman produced an official-looking stamp sheet acquired through channels she didn't explain, adding a seal that lent false authenticity. The teenage girl contributed a recommendation letter on stolen letterhead from a legitimate carpentry business. Each edition layered plausibility onto the fiction that would need to withstand inspection by guards trained to spot exactly such deceptions. "You'll leave at first light during the morning market rush," Madame Rousseau decided. "O'Malley hears confessions starting at dawn. You enter as any Catholic seeking spiritual guidance before work. Natural enough that it shouldn't raise immediate questions, though the church will certainly be watched." The night passed in fragments of restless waiting. Tobias shared the hidden room behind the kitchen pantry with the young fugitive whose scars told stories of whippings survived. They didn't exchange names, understanding that ignorance provided protection if either faced interrogation. Sleep came in brief intervals punctuated by sounds from the street outside. Patrols passing with lanterns and questions. Dogs barking at shadows. Once, guards stopped directly outside and demanded entry. Madame Rousseau handled them with practiced calm, explaining through the partially open door that she ran a respectable establishment for free people of color and resented implications otherwise. The guards searched anyway, boots tramping through public rooms while Tobias pressed himself against the hidden compartment's far wall and controlled his breathing to silence. They found nothing because there was nothing visible to find. The secret space remained undetected behind stacked pantry goods arranged to appear undisturbed. Dawn arrived with humid air already thick enough to taste. Madame Rousseau woke them with gentle knocks, passing coffee and cornbread through the opening before helping them emerge from cramped quarters. The boarding house had come alive with coordinated activity. 3 men departed at careful intervals, each dressed similarly to Tobias, each moving in different directions. The decoys would create false sightings, force city guards to spread resources thin chasing phantoms. Tobias left during peak morning chaos when streets filled with workers, vendors, and enslaved people running errands. He carried the ledger wrapped in oilcloth and tied with common twine to resemble carpenter's tools. The weight felt heavier than its actual substance, dense with the accumulated crimes of years and the potential to wound men who'd considered themselves untouchable. St. Augustine's Church rose above surrounding buildings with architecture serving the city's free people of color and enslaved Catholics whose masters permitted such worship. Tobias climbed the front steps and entered dim interior space where candles flickered before saints and the massive crucifix dominated everything. A handful of early worshippers knelt in prayer, their devotion either genuine or excellent camouflage for other purposes. He approached the confession booth where Father O'Malley's distinctive red hair was visible through carved screens. The Irish priest had built his reputation on fiery sermons that criticized slavery's brutality without quite calling for abolition, walking theological tightropes that let him continue operating in a city that expelled or killed more radical voices. "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned." Tobias spoke the ritual words quietly before adding in barely audible whisper, "I bring evidence from Madame Rousseau." The priest's hand appeared through the screen's small opening without hesitation, as if he'd been expecting exactly this delivery. "Tell me your transgressions, my son," while his fingers closed around the wrapped package. Tobias passed the ledger through, feeling it leave his possession with mixed emotions. Relief that the burden was transferred. Loss of the last physical connection to Benjamin beyond memory. "I have committed violence against my oppressor. I feel no repentance for it." Father O'Malley unwrapped the oilcloth and his breath caught audibly when he scanned the first entries. "This is extraordinary. Do you understand what you've brought me? This implicates dozens of prominent citizens in federal crimes. The newspapers in Boston will devour this content. It could influence congressional debates about slavery's expansion into Western territories. My son is documented on page 47, Tobias said. Benjamin. 9 years old when sold. 13 when killed. Listed as damaged goods representing acceptable loss. The priest found the page and read in heavy silence. When he finally spoke, genuine grief colored his voice. "I am profoundly sorry for your loss. No father should read his child's death recorded like livestock inventory. I will ensure Benjamin's name is remembered when this story reaches publication. He will not disappear among statistics. They say Armand Laveau is dying." Tobias needed to know what was already common knowledge. They say he was poisoned during his evening grooming ritual. The city guard is searching for his personal barber, a man named Tobias. Father O'Malley's tone carried clear warning. There's a substantial reward offered. $200 to anyone providing information leading to capture. That's enough money to tempt even sympathetic souls. Tobias absorbed this without visible reaction. The price on his head was less than Benjamin had been sold for, a detail carrying dark poetry. Will the ledger be sufficient to shift attention from hunting me toward investigating the men it exposes? Eventually, certainly. But such shifts take time. Journalists need to verify information through multiple sources. Politicians need to position themselves to exploit emerging scandals. Public opinion requires careful shaping through strategic revelations. You have days at best, possibly weeks before this becomes the dominant story. Until then, you remain a fugitive slave who murdered his master. That's the simple narrative that will drive the manhunt. What should I do? The question emerged with genuine curiosity rather than plea for direction. Father O'Malley shifted in the confessional booth. Survive long enough to witness whether this matters. Reach northern states where you can tell your complete story to people who might actually listen and act. The Underground Railroad will move you, but it requires absolute trust in conductors you've never met and patience with processes that seem impossibly slow. Can you manage that? Tobias thought about 7 years shaving a monster's throat while dreaming of cutting deeper. Patience had been his primary survival tool for decades. A few more weeks or months seemed manageable if they led toward actual freedom rather than mere performance of servitude. I can do whatever is required. Then go with God's blessing. The priest's hand appeared briefly through the screen in benediction. You've struck a blow that will echo longer than you know. Armand Laveau's death is unfortunate, but exposure of this network's crimes might actually save lives. Sometimes violent resistance represents the only moral option remaining when all peaceful avenues have been systematically blocked. Tobias rose and moved toward the exit with measured calm despite every instinct screaming to run. Morning light outside seemed impossibly bright after the church's dimness. He descended steps and merged into street traffic, just another laborer beginning his workday among thousands doing the same. The walk back to Madame Rousseau's boarding house required navigating the French Quarter's morning chaos. Vendors hawking goods. Enslaved people running errands with baskets. White merchants opening shops. Tobias kept his head down and paced steady, fighting paranoia that suggested every glance in his direction represented recognition. He arrived to find Madame Rousseau waiting with news that shifted everything. Armand Laveau died 20 minutes ago. Before dying, he regained consciousness long enough to identify you specifically as his poisoner. The city guard has issued arrest warrants. They're offering $300 now and they've authorized deadly force if you resist capture. Tobias absorbed this information with outward calm while his mind raced through implications. The belladonna had accomplished its purpose, providing crucial hours to deliver the ledger before Armand's death made the manhunt urgent. Now came the truly dangerous phase. She guided him to a back room where a large trunk sat open, its interior modified with hidden breathing holes and a false bottom creating a cramped compartment barely large enough for a man to curl into. This would be his transportation out of the city, disguised as cargo being moved to a plantation upriver. You'll travel approximately 6 hours to the first transfer point. The wagon will stop where you'll be handed to the next conductor. From there, you move through a series of safe houses heading north. Each person along the chain knows only their immediate contacts. If you're captured, you can't betray the whole network because you don't know the whole network. Before Tobias climbed inside, Madame Rousseau pressed a small pouch into his hand. Emergency funds and a contact name in Tennessee. Use it only if absolutely necessary. Every revealed contact becomes compromised. The trunk lid closed, cutting off light and most air. The wagon lurched forward, wheels grinding over cobblestones. Through breathing holes, Tobias glimpsed fragments of the city passing. The heat built until the space became an oven testing his endurance. Hours passed in cramped darkness punctuated by checkpoint stops where guards inspected cargo. Eventually cobblestones gave way to dirt roads. The wagon finally stopped in what sounded like a barn. The trunk opened and Tobias emerged slowly, body protesting every movement. 3 people waited with water and urgent expressions. Welcome to the first station. We've got 4 hours until the next transport. Through the barn door, fields stretched toward a horizon representing not freedom yet, but the long difficult road that might eventually lead there. The ledger was bound for Boston. Armand Laveau was dead. Benjamin's death had been answered with more than personal vengeance. The elderly white woman stepped forward with a bowl of stew that smelled of vegetables and salt pork. You need strength for what comes next. The journey north takes weeks, sometimes months. Each station presents new dangers, new people to trust or avoid, new decisions that determine whether you live free or die trying. One of the black men gestured toward a loft area above the barn's main floor. You'll rest there until midnight. Then we move you by boat along the bayou routes where patrols can't follow easily. After that, another wagon, another hiding place, another set of strangers risking their lives to pass you along this chain. Tobias accepted the bowl and climbed into the loft where hay provided crude bedding. His body ached from hours compressed in the trunk, muscles cramping with each movement. The stew tasted of earth and survival, nothing like the elaborate dishes he'd prepared in Armand's kitchen. Simple food eaten as a free man carried flavors no slave's meal could match. Below, the three conductors spoke in low voices about routes and timing. The elderly woman mentioned increased patrols along the Mississippi since 3 runaways had been caught last week trying to cross near Baton Rouge. The men discussed alternate paths through swamp country where bloodhounds lost scent in standing water. Every detail mattered. Every miscalculation could mean capture, return to bondage, or worse. Tobias pulled the straight razor from his pocket and examined it in the dim light filtering through barn slats. The blade that had shaved Armand's throat hundreds of times without cutting now served a different purpose. Insurance against capture. He'd decided during those cramped hours in the trunk that he would never be returned to slavery alive. Death was preferable to the torture that awaited fugitives who killed their masters. He tucked the razor away and closed his eyes, trying to rest before midnight came with its new dangers. Freedom existed somewhere beyond these Louisiana swamps, beyond Mississippi rivers and Tennessee mountains, in northern cities where a black man might walk without papers and live without masters. Now came the hardest part, surviving long enough to discover whether any of it actually mattered. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.